This is 12-year-old Nikita, a little boy who, completely naked and covered in blood, threw himself out of a second-floor window just to reach the nearest store and beg for help. The workers inside were horrified when they saw him. His body was covered in injuries, and the only thing he kept begging them was to save his family. It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie about a serial killer. But this actually happened. On December 3, 2019, in Tatarstan, a 12-year-old boy survived something unimaginably brutal. And later, he was able to tell investigators what happened inside his family's apartment that night. An apartment covered in blood from wall to wall. His mother and his two brothers had been murdered. One of those boys was only 2 years old, and he'd been stabbed 35 times. And before we get into the case, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and left a comment to support all the work that went into covering this story. This tragedy happened on the night of December 3, 2019, inside an apartment on Yubilina Street in the city of Mendeleevsk, a small town in the Republic of Tatarstan with a population of around 22,000 people. Living in that apartment was a family of 5, 41-year-old Ainur Kharisov, 38-year-old Angelina Bashirova, and their 3 sons. The oldest son, 19-year-old Kirill, was Angelina's child from her first marriage. 12-year-old Nikita was born from another relationship. And the youngest child, 2-year-old Ruslan, was Angelina and Ainur's son together. Angelina Bashirova was born on January 3, 1981, in Mendeleevsk. She studied at school number 3. She wasn't an outstanding student, but she did well in school and never had any serious behavior problems. Teachers and people who knew her always spoke positively about her. After graduating, Angelina moved to the city of Glazov and studied teaching at Korolenko University. While she was there, she got married, became pregnant, and soon gave birth to her son Kirill. But the marriage didn't last long. 3 years later, she got divorced and moved back to Mendeleevsk. About a year later, she met another man, and a few years after that, Nikita was born. But that relationship eventually fell apart too, and the man left the family. 4 years, Angelina worked while raising her children on her own, until she met Ainur Kharisov in 2015. Ainur was only 3 years older than her. He was short, very thin, and at first, he seemed completely fine with Angelina already having children. In the beginning, things actually looked pretty normal. They lived together, raised the kids together, and tried to build a family. But slowly, things started getting worse. Ainur began drinking heavily and borrowing money from people to gamble. By the time this tragedy happened, Angelina was working in social services, and unlike her husband, she didn't drink at all. Friends and relatives described her as a kind, caring, and devoted woman who had always dreamed of having a big, peaceful family. 41-year-old Ainur Kharisov was an alcoholic drowning in debt, and day by day, his relationship with Angelina kept getting worse. At one point, Ainur even told his mother that Angelina didn't love him anymore. That only made him more jealous and more angry. On December 2, 2019, Ainur came back to Mendeleevsk from a work trip in Yelabuga to see his family. That night, he got access to Angelina's phone and saw messages between her and one of their neighbors. The neighbor had only asked her to pick up a tax document for him. There was nothing suspicious in the messages, but Ainur didn't care. Then he started going through his wife's personal belongings. And inside her coat pocket, he found the neighbor's passport. At that point, Ainur became convinced Angelina was cheating on him, even though she explained that she only had the passport because of the tax paperwork. But by then, nothing she said mattered anymore. Ainur decided he would wait until she fell asleep and then kill her. He went back into the kitchen, where he'd been sitting, took a few shots of alcohol, calmly smoked a cigarette, grabbed a knife, and started walking toward the bedroom. Inside the room, Angelina was asleep next to their 2-year-old son. Ainur walked over to the bed and started stabbing her. He stabbed Angelina 20 times, killing her almost instantly. Hearing Angelina screaming, 19-year-old Kirill ran out from the next room and told 12-year-old Nikita to stay where he was. This wasn't the first time Kirill had dealt with his drunk stepfather. He'd already had to throw Ainur out of the apartment multiple times before. But this time was different. Kirill attacked him from behind and tried to choke him. But in that state of rage, Ainur managed to break free and slit Kirill's throat. And even that wasn't enough for him. After that, he stabbed Kirill another 24 times just to make sure he was dead. After killing Kirill, that monster turned to his own 2-year-old son, Ruslan. To this day, nobody understands what a 2-year-old child could possibly do to make someone feel that much hatred. But Ainur showed absolutely no mercy. Ruslan had suffered the most injuries out of everyone in the apartment. Doctors counted 34 stab wounds on the little boy's body. And unbelievably, despite those injuries, he was still alive for a short time afterward. And as you remember, Nikita was still hiding in the bedroom. By the time Ainur walked into the room, the 12-year-old had crawled underneath the bed. Ainur grabbed him by the leg, dragged him out, and started stabbing him too. But it didn't even seem like he wanted to kill him quickly. It was almost like he wanted the boy to suffer. At one point, Nikita stopped resisting. And right then, Angelina, lying on the floor in the other room, made a choking sound. Ainur immediately went back to finish her off, believing Nikita was already dead too. But Nikita had covered his wounds with a blanket and pretended to be dead. The whole time, he stayed completely still inside that room while Ainur was in the bathroom washing his wife and children's blood off his body. Without panicking, Nikita grabbed a chair, smashed the second-floor window, and threw himself out into the snow. The window didn't have a handle and couldn't be opened, so there was no other way for him to escape. And while climbing through the broken glass, he badly cut himself even more. In the freezing December cold, wearing nothing but his underwear, Nikita ran to a 24-hour bakery called Dobropek, about 7 minutes away from the apartment. When the workers saw him standing there covered in blood, they were completely shocked. Nikita told them his stepfather had murdered his mother and 2 brothers, tortured him, and left deep cuts all over his body. But somehow, he'd managed to escape. Security camera footage later showed Nikita walking into the bakery and searching behind the counter for the employees. You could actually see the trail of blood he left behind on the floor tiles. A few minutes later, paramedics arrived. They placed Nikita onto a stretcher and carefully wrapped him in blankets. One of the bakery workers later said, "When he came in, he was only wearing underwear. Nothing else. No shoes, no jacket, nothing. At first, we didn't even understand what was happening. Then the cashier followed him into the store and suddenly screamed. I ran over too, and the boy was covered in blood. We started asking him what happened. And right away he told us his stepfather had killed his mother and brother." Nikita's physical condition was no longer life-threatening, but the psychological trauma was far worse. Specialists at the Kamsky Children's Medical Center worked with him afterward, but it was obvious recovering from what he'd seen would take a very long time. After all of this, Ainur calmly took off his clothes and went into the bathroom to wash his family's blood off himself. Then he sat down and wrote a note saying he would be the next one to die. In the letter, he tried to justify the murders by calling it love, and claimed this was somehow better for all of them. One part of the note said, "This is the man she cheated on me with, and she's probably still cheating on me. I can't live without her. Forgive me, it's better for us to be together in the next world." Ainur wrote those words in a note that he later placed inside the neighbor's passport, the same passport he saw as proof of Angelina's imaginary affair. Then he locked the apartment door and walked away. He threw the keys somewhere along the road and took a taxi back to Yelabuga. And while that monster spent what would become his last night of freedom drinking nonstop, his 2-year-old son was still alive inside the apartment, slowly dying. Even though Ruslan had suffered the most injuries out of everyone, somehow the little boy was still hanging on. At around 4 in the morning, police arrived at the apartment after emergency services received the call. They kept knocking on the door, but nobody answered. And instead of a working doorbell, all they found was a cut wire hanging out of the wall. Police and rescue workers spent almost half an hour trying to break the door open, and because of that, a huge amount of critical time was lost. When they finally cut through the lock and got inside, they walked into an absolute nightmare. The floors and walls were covered in blood. Angelina's body was lying near the entrance to the living room, and Kirill's body was inside one of the bedrooms. But then, they heard something coming from deeper inside the apartment. their 2-year-old son was still alive. The boy was rushed to the hospital immediately, but there was nothing the doctors could do. Ruslin died a few hours later. There was so much blood inside the apartment that it couldn't simply be cleaned with mops and towels. Workers later had to literally shovel it off the floor. Neighbors later said they'd heard screaming and fighting that night, but nobody could have imagined what was actually happening inside that apartment. One neighbor later said, "Everybody was crying. People felt especially horrible for the children. They said the man was extremely drunk. Everyone heard the screams, but nobody came outside." Despite the note he left behind, Ainur didn't even have the courage to hurt himself. The very same night of the murders, the drunk 41-year-old showed up at work, bought more alcohol and food, and casually told his co-workers and supervisor what he'd done. After that, he just laid down on a couch and went to sleep like nothing had happened. When his co-workers noticed the blood on his clothes, they informed their boss, who immediately called the police. The only thing Ainur later claimed he couldn't remember was stabbing 12-year-old Nikita. Even afterward, he still refused to fully admit to attacking him. From the outside, Ainur Kharisov looked like a completely ordinary man. He worked as a plumber in Yelabuga. Looking at old photos of him, it's honestly hard to believe something that horrific was going on inside his head. But his past was far from clean. Ainur was born on July 20th, 1978, in the city of Yelabuga. His father abandoned the family very early on, and he was raised by his mother alone, a woman who spent most of her time working in stores and barely had time to raise her son. Ainur's criminal behavior started back in school. He got into fights, stole things, and constantly caused problems. His family wasn't poor. His mother earned enough money to buy him clothes and food, but for some reason, Ainur was never satisfied. After school, he joined the military and served as a border guard in Nalchik. As far as anyone knows, there were never any complaints about him during his service. But after leaving the military, he had no interest in continuing his education. He started doing manual labor jobs instead. The money wasn't enough for him though, and before long, he went back to stealing. Sometime later, he met a woman and started living with her. Eventually, they had a child together. Some sources even claim the child was born with a disability. Since there weren't many decent job opportunities in the village, Ainur chose what he thought was the easier path: theft. And that decision sent him to prison for the first time. He spent less than a year behind bars before getting released, but nothing about him really changed. Not long after that, he got into a serious fight with his mother-in-law and attacked her with a knife. The woman didn't stay silent and reported him to the police, which led to Ainur ending up in court for a second time. Back then, he acted extremely remorseful and only received a 3-year suspended sentence. During that same period, he abandoned both his partner and their disabled child and moved to Yelabuga, where he quickly started a new life with another woman and had another child. But Ainur was never interested in a quiet, stable life. As soon as his suspended sentence ended, he went right back to crime again. This time, he stole 50,000 rubles from someone's bag. And once again, because he confessed and acted sorry, he received a lighter sentence. Eventually, he abandoned his second family too. He didn't even have an official job, which meant he wasn't paying child support for either of his children. Then in 2015, it suddenly looked like maybe he was finally changing. Through a dating website, he met Angelina online. He constantly complimented her, gave her attention, and promised he'd left that criminal lifestyle behind for good. He had stopped drinking and seemed to genuinely want a normal family life. At least judging by the photos Angelina posted on social media, everything looked happy from the outside. But there was one person who never trusted Ainur from the very beginning: Angelina's mother. She felt there was something dark and unsettling about him. Eventually, in 2016, Ainur and Angelina officially got married. At first, Ainur treated Angelina's children kindly and tried to help raise them, but he never got along with the oldest son, Kirill. Kirill was athletic, strong, and independent, and he hated being lectured by Ainur or having him act like a father figure. Near the end of 2017, Angelina and Ainur's child was born. A little boy both of them seemed incredibly happy about. Ainur insisted on naming him Ruslin, and Angelina didn't argue with him. But little by little, things started changing again. Ainur was gambling, losing huge amounts of money, drowning in debt, and eventually started drinking again too. At the same time, his jealousy and anger toward Angelina kept getting worse. By the spring of 2019, things had become a lot more serious. Whenever Ainur came home from work, he'd drink heavily, and his behavior became more aggressive than ever. That was also the first time he physically attacked Angelina. When Kirill stepped in, Ainur tried going after him too, but Kirill was younger, stronger, and much bigger than his drunk stepfather. He stopped him, forced him out of the apartment, and threw him outside. Drunk and furious, Ainur grabbed a rock and smashed the windows of the car Angelina had bought years earlier on installments, long before she ever met him. The next morning, once he sobered up, he came back trying to apologize and make peace. But they refused to let him into the apartment, and from that point on, Ainur and Angelina started living separately. Ainur moved back in with his mother in Yelabuga, where he continued drinking and wasting her money on gambling. Over time, Angelina still gave him chances to change. She told him that if he quit drinking and paid off his debts, maybe they could live together again someday. In November 2019, Ainur completed a 3-week rehab program. After that, he visited Angelina and the kids, spent a little time playing with Ruslan, but things between them already felt cold and distant. Ainur wanted Angelina to move to Moscow with him so they could both work and pay off his debts together. But by then, it seemed like Angelina no longer saw any future in that relationship and was slowly pulling further and further away from him every day. She just never got the chance to fully leave the man who was spiraling completely out of control. Ainur Kharisov's crime shocked all of Tatarstan. Thousands of people showed up to the funeral for Angelina, Kirill, and little 2-year-old Ruslan. People brought flowers, candles, and children's toys to the graves. There was a real fear that Ainur could be killed before the trial even started, so authorities kept him isolated in a special cell and transported him under heavy security for every reconstruction and investigation procedure. The investigation officially ended in April, and the trial began on May 25th. 2 separate psychiatric evaluations confirmed that Ainur was mentally competent and fully responsible for his actions. At first, he didn't deny the murders, but later, he claimed he'd been in a temporary state of insanity during the attack. He also had an old head injury, though experts said it had nothing to do with his behavior. Inside the courtroom stood a short, skinny man wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He had a mask on, his hair was neatly combed, and as strange as it sounds considering the situation, he looked calm and well put together. He constantly tried to hide his face from reporters. During the trial, witnesses testified one after another. Angelina's relatives, neighbors, Ainur's co-workers, and also Nikita, the only survivor from that night. Ainur's own mother never showed up to court even once. People said that when she found out what her son had done, she only said one thing: "He's not my son anymore." Nikita behaved incredibly bravely during the trial. The court even offered to temporarily remove Ainur from the room while Nikita testified, but he refused. As terrified as he was, the boy pulled himself together, looked directly at the man who murdered his family, and described everything that happened that night. During the trial, Ainur apologized to Nikita and said, "I should have drunk less." Then he added, "I am completely guilty, and I truly regret what I did. I fully understand that there's no forgiveness for me, but I'm still asking for it anyway. First from the victims and their families, and then from everyone else. Forgive me, Your Honor. I ask you to give me a chance to make up for this somehow. But if I don't deserve that chance, then sentence me to death." Ainur said all of it in a cold, emotionless voice, without a single expression on his face. During the trial, the prosecutor of Tatarstan also mentioned several things that, legally, could have been considered mitigating circumstances. For example, Ainur had a disabled son from a previous relationship, a child he never really spoke to or supported in any way, but under the law, it still counted as a factor that could reduce his sentence. There was also his sick mother, the same woman who had publicly disowned him after the murders, and the same person Ainur used to pressure for money to spend on alcohol and gambling. And most importantly, his confession. But even after considering all of those things, The prosecutor said there was still no punishment other than life imprisonment that could possibly fit a crime like this. In the end, on July 20, 2020, the Supreme Court of Tatarstan sentenced 41-year-old Ainur Kharisov to life in prison. He was convicted for the murders of 38-year-old Angelina, her 19-year-old son Kirill, and his own 2-year-old son, Ruslan. Angelina's 12-year-old son, Nikita, survived despite his injuries after managing to escape from the apartment. The court also approved financial compensation claims against Ainur totaling 3.5 million rubles, 3 million for Angelina's mother, and another 500,000 for Nikita. During the trial, Ainur claimed he murdered his wife because she constantly made him jealous. Meanwhile, Angelina had repeatedly tried to explain that there was no reason for jealousy at all. She was simply exhausted by the relationship and wanted to leave him. While announcing the sentence, the judge said, "The nature, brutality, and method of these crimes show that Ainur Kharisov had become completely cruel and indifferent toward human life, regardless of the victim's age, gender, or even family relationship to him. His actions showed the development of an antisocial personality with no respect for laws, morality, or basic human values." And in the end, one more important detail came out during the investigation. After reviewing the messages between Angelina Bashirova and Ainur Safayelan, the neighbor Ainur believed she was involved with, the court found absolutely no evidence of any affair. In fact, even when Ainur murdered his own son, he fully believed Ruslan was his biological child.